A German Shepherd puppy wasn't meant to survive the night, 10 degrees snow cutting sideways, and a school backpack left abandoned on a lonely bus stop bench. Zipper barely open for a trembling nose and a pair of amber eyes. Inside was a wrinkled note, a name, an apology, a plea for kindness. Across the street, Ethan McGraw, a former cavalry soldier, spotted her and recognized that kind of waiting, the kind that scars a soul. Miles away, Caleb Dawson, only 11, held his breath, convinced he had already lost the only loyal friend he ever had. What followed would shatter your heart and mend it in the same breath. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Share your state or country in the comments. And if you believe no person or animal should be left out in the cold, hit subscribe. This story might just restore your faith in miracles. The storm had a way of swallowing Anchorage whole, as if the city itself were only another shadow crushed under snow and wind. Afternoon looked no different than midnight, the sky flat gray, a faint dim light bleeding through heavy clouds. Snow lashed sideways, driven by a merciless wind that coated roof signs and the faint glow of street lamps in a white blur. The thermometer had dropped to 10 degrees, the streets deserted, hushed except for the storm's howl and the crunch of ice underfoot. Ethan McGraw pulled his coat tighter as he trudged down the frozen road, boots cracking the ice crust with every step. At 41, he carried the weight of lives lost in the slope of his shoulders. Once a cavalryman in the harshest campaigns, he had ridden through deserts and valleys far from home. Tall, lean, but powerful, his body spoke of endurance and battles survived. His face was weathered tan, clinging stubbornly even in the Alaskan cold. Lines creased the corners of his eyes from years squinting into dust and sun. His square jaw was rough with stubble, his dark hair streaked with gray, parted neatly from an old soldier's habit. But it was his eyes, steel gray, steady, reflective, that told his story. Eyes of a man who had seen too much, who had buried comrades and carried their absence like stones in his chest. Since leaving the cavalry, he had chosen solitude, a small cabin by the forest's edge outside Anchorage. To most it would seem lonely, but to Ethan it was quiet, the only kind of silence he could trust. It was not the silence after a firefight, when you prayed the man beside you would breathe again. This afternoon, with snow stinging his face and breath hanging in pale clouds, all he wanted was his cabin, the wood stove's glow, and the fire chewing through pine logs stacked by the door. Yet, as he crossed an intersection, his gaze caught something odd at the bus stop. At first it looked like a snowbank piled high against the bench, a mound half buried but too deliberate in shape. Narrowing his eyes, Ethan tugged his gloves tighter and crunched across the street toward the shelter. What he saw stole the air from his lungs. It wasn't a mound at all, but a form small, curled, frighteningly still. Nestled in a faded school backpack, zipper, cracked open just wide enough, lay a German Shepherd puppy. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 months old, her body folded in tight, as if trying to vanish, her fur matted with frozen flakes. She was thin, far too thin. Her ribs faintly showed through the black and tan coat that should have gleamed with health. The backpack straps hung stiff, frozen against the ground, and from the flap poked a tiny, trembling nose. Her eyes lifted to his wide amber, too big for her small face. They carried a desperate plea, a hope stretched thin as glass, not fixed on him, nor even on the storm, but somewhere far away, as though still waiting for a figure who had promised to return. Ethan froze a few steps away, his chest tightening. He had seen those eyes before, not in dogs, but in men. Soldiers left behind children in battle zones, eyes torn between fear and the fragile thread of hope. He crouched low into the snow, careful not to tower over her. "Easy, girl," he murmured, voice low, steady, the same tone he had once used with frightened villagers far from home. The pup flinched, but didn't run, didn't growl, didn't blink. She simply trembled inside the nylon shell, a leaf too tired to fall. Ethan extended a gloved hand, not touching, just letting his presence speak. Up close, he saw the rawness on her paws, pads cracked and reddened from the frozen concrete. Frost tipped her whiskers, her oversized ears twitching as if still straining to hear footsteps that would never return. No collar circled her neck, though the faint imprint in her fur told she had worn one not long ago. The backpack carried the faint scent of crayons and bubblegum traces of a child's world, not a grown-up's. Ethan McGraw's gaze shifted to the side pocket where something stiff poked out beneath the flap. It looked like folded paper, but he didn't reach for it yet. Not now. Instead, he focused on the trembling pup. "What are you doing out here?" he whispered, knowing full well she couldn't answer. Snow swirled hard around them, the cold biting straight through his heavy coat. Yet he stayed crouched because something in her stillness spoke directly to him. Daisy, he didn't know her name. Yet wasn't just another stray. She was a mirror of abandonment, of loyalty stretched to its breaking point. And her fragile body shivered not only from the cold, but from the ache of waiting. Dogs, Ethan knew, were creatures of attachment. This little one hadn't stayed inside that backpack for warmth. She had stayed because it was the last place she had seen the one who left her. His chest tightened. He thought of Ben Carter, the comrade who had fallen during a desert patrol. He remembered how they'd left Ben's pack on the sand for identification. Ethan had walked past it, seen the dust clinging to the straps, and felt the sting of knowing that sometimes all that remained of a man was the thing he carried last. Looking at the pup tucked into the worn bag, he felt that same pain, as if someone had placed her there carefully, then walked away out of necessity or fear. The wind whipped violently against the shelter, rattling the thin frame. Ethan edged closer, his knees pressing into the snow. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice steady as stone. Her ears twitched, and for the first time she blinked. A small thing, but it stirred something in him. He thought of his cabin, the scent of wood smoke clinging to the rafters, the warmth of the stove. He thought of how empty it always felt at night, silence pressing down on him until sleep finally dragged him under. And suddenly he realized maybe it wasn't only her who needed saving. For a long while, man and dog sat together in the storm, both shaped by solitude, both carrying ghosts. Then Ethan drew a slow breath, straightened, and reached for the backpack straps. He would not leave her here, not in this storm, not in this silence. His breath curled white into the frozen air as he lifted the faded bag from the icy bench, careful not to jar the tiny bundle inside. The German Shepherd pup was far too light for her age. She pressed herself into the corner of the pack, as if the nylon walls could hold the world at bay. Ethan slung the straps over his shoulder, cradling her close, and the little one gave a faint whimper, more sigh than protest. The snow thickened, stinging his face, as he turned up his collar and pushed toward the nearest street lamp's glow. Anchorage's streets were deserted, cars buried in drifts, storefronts shuttered tight. Somewhere a plow groaned, but here the only sounds were the crunch of his boots and the faint rustle inside the backpack. He ducked back under the shelter to shield her from the worst of the wind, setting the bag gently on his knee. For the first time, he tugged open the side pocket and pulled free the folded scrap of paper. His gloves stiff with ice, he peeled them off the sting of cold, biting his bare fingers as he unfolded the fragile note. The paper was worn, softened by handling creased, as though opened and closed many times. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was uneven letters leaning sideways, written in haste by trembling hands. Her name is Daisy. I'm sorry. I had to. Please be kind. She's good. Ethan stared at the words, the snow blurring beyond. Simple. Childlike. And yet the message cut deeper than anything ornate could have. His thumb brushed across the shaky pencil strokes, instantly recognizing the touch of a child's hand. The apology was not careless. The plea for kindness was desperate. Whoever left her here hadn't done it lightly. The pup stirred inside the pack, shifting as though sensing his silence. Ethan looked down at her amber eyes peeking from the zipper fold. Daisy, he said softly, letting the name roll into the frozen air. Her ears twitched again, not full recognition, but something close, as if her name tethered her to a memory. Ethan leaned back against the pole of the shelter, the storm rattling around them. For a long moment, he simply held the note. He had seen countless letters in his life, formal orders, casualty reports, crumpled photos folded into helmets. But this scrap of paper carried a weight heavier than most. It dragged him back away from the snow, away from Anchorage, back to dust and desert heat, where the air burned your lungs and children clutched broken toys like shields. He remembered their wary eyes, the way they clung to anything alive for comfort. He remembered kneeling once in the dirt, handing a bottle of water to a little girl, no older than 10. Her dress was torn, her knees scraped raw, and she had looked up at him with eyes that held both gratitude and terror. Days later, her village was gone, burned to the ground. He never saw Nita Sky again. That memory, like so many others, had hardened something deep inside him, carving channels of guilt that no years of service could ever wash away. And now here was Daisy crammed inside a child's backpack with a plea scribbled in a hand too young to know how to protect itself. Ethan McGraw's chest tightened until he let out a sharp exhale just to breathe. The squeal of tires cut through the storm. A pickup rattled past headlights, carving through the whiteout. Behind the wheel, the driver hunched low, a heavy wool cap shadowing his face. He glanced once toward the shelter eyes catching on Ethan and the pack at his side, then drove on into the blizzard. A reminder that the world outside kept moving, indifferent to the quiet tragedies tucked into its corners. Ethan folded the note carefully and slid it back into the pocket. He zipped it shut, rose and slung the pack over his shoulder. "You're not staying here," he muttered, half to himself, half to the trembling pup. Daisy pressed deeper into the nylon, silent, as if she understood. He started toward his cabin boots, crunching through the drifts, the city thinning quickly behind him, houses giving way to stretches of pine dark against the pale snow. His cabin stood on a rise built of weathered logs, with a blackened stone chimney and a porch dusted always in frost. He had hammered some of it together with his own hands years ago, back when building anything felt better than watching it collapse. Now it was the only place he called home. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the warm scent of cedar and faint ash greeting him. He stepped inside, shutting out the storm, and set the backpack gently down by the worn rug near the stove. Kneeling, he unzipped the top just enough for Daisy to poke her head free. She sniffed cautiously, ears swiveling at the unfamiliar scents of pine resin, old books, and the lingering trace of coffee. Ethan didn't coax her out. Instead, he lit the stove, feeding kindling until the flames caught, filling the room with a steady warmth. Firelight flickered in her amber eyes, bright in the dim cabin. She didn't step out, not yet, but her gaze tracked him as he moved. He shrugged off his coat, hung it by the door, and crouched low again, resting his arms on his knees. "You've been waiting, haven't you?" he said softly. The pup blinked once, slow, as though carrying the weight of the truth. Ethan leaned back, staring into the fire. He thought again of the words on the note, "I had to." What kind of choice forced a child to leave their only companion at a bus stop? Poverty. Fear. Violence. He had seen families ripped apart by all of them. Whatever the reason, Daisy had been left with nothing but hope and a scrap of paper, and that was a fate he could not let stand. Time slipped by as the storm pressed against the cabin walls. Ethan sat with Daisy in the glow of the fire, the note safe in his coat pocket. He knew bone deep he would never abandon her. Not now. Not ever. The fire burned low in the iron stove shadows, stretching across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm raged, pounding snow against the shutters and door, but inside there was warmth, a fragile island carved out of the Alaskan night. Ethan stood with hands braced on his knees, staring at the small form still curled deep inside the backpack. Daisy's head had popped out a few times, nose twitching at the scents of pine and smoke, but each time she retreated, burrowing back, as though only that nylon shell could keep her world intact. The old cavalryman felt a helplessness he hadn't known in war. In battle, there were orders, reactions, choices. Here there was only waiting. He knew enough about dogs to understand trust wasn't demanded, it was earned heartbeat by heartbeat. Rising, his knees cracking, he crossed to the cupboard above the counter. The kitchen was bare, a few shelves, a dented kettle, coffee tins and cans collected without thought. His hand settled on one in particular, the label faded but recognizable dog food. He'd bought it a year earlier after a stray mutt had hung around for weeks before vanishing into the woods. That mutt had been wild ribs showing, but Ethan had done what he could until one day it never came back. Still, he'd kept the can. Some part of him must have known he'd need it again. He peeled back the lid, the metallic click loud in the hush of the cabin. The smell was sharp, hardly appetizing to him, but Daisy's ears twitched at the sound. Ethan McGraw scooped some into a shallow dish, poured warm water from the kettle, and stirred until a faint curl of steam rose. He placed the bowl on the floor near the rug, not too close to the backpack, then stepped back and sank heavily onto the low bench by the stove. For long minutes, nothing happened. Inside the pack, Daisy shifted her eyes, glinting in the firelight, but she didn't move toward the food. Ethan sat patiently, his breath slow, his posture steady. He had done this before, waiting in dusty villages overseas, hoping a frightened child might decide the stranger in uniform could be trusted. He remembered one boy in particular, skinny as a twig with a jaw set like stone, who had finally taken the ration bar Ethan offered and broken it in half to share with his sister. That same kind of fragile waiting filled the cabin now. At last, Daisy stirred, stretching one tentative paw over the pack's edge, her claws clicking lightly against the wood floor. She sniffed the air, the smell of meat and warmth drawing her forward. Slowly, as though every inch demanded courage, she crept out. Her body was lean, underfed, her fur still clumped where snow had frozen into it. She moved stiffly, legs shaky but determined. Ethan didn't speak, didn't move, only watched as she edged toward the bowl. When she reached it, she lowered her head, licked once, then pulled back quickly, her eyes flicking up at him, as if waiting for permission. He gave none, only a slight nod. After another pause, she began to eat in careful bites, cautious, as though the food might vanish or be snatched away. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight, Hunger, he understood, mistrust even more. When she'd eaten enough to dull the edge of her need, Daisy turned in a slow circle and padded back to the backpack. She ignored the soft blanket Ethan had spread near the stove and climbed inside again, curling tight into her nylon shell. Her amber eyes locked on him through the opening, steady, unblinking, until at last her head sank onto her paws. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand across his face. "You're clinging to something that's already gone," he murmured. He knew the feeling too well. That backpack wasn't comfort. It was memory. And memory could weigh heavier than the coldest snow. Outside, the storm rumbled like distant artillery. Ethan rose to check the shutters, making sure they held. He poured himself a mug of bitter coffee and drank it standing by the stove. He should have been tired, but instead a restless energy worked through him. His eyes drifted back to Daisy, to the way her body trembled even in sleep, and he wondered who had folded that note. A child. Surely. But why he pictured small hands tucking paper into the pocket, whispering the pup's name before walking away. The thought carved deep into him. Hours passed like that, the fire dimming and being stoked again. Once Daisy whimpered in her sleep, paws twitching as though she were chasing something in a dream. Ethan crouched beside the pack, resisting the urge to reach in. "Easy, Daisy," he whispered, the name still new on his tongue. "You're safe here." She didn't wake, but her breathing slowed, steadied, as if his voice reached someplace even sleep couldn't block off. By dawn, the storm had softened into a steady fall of snow, blanketing the world outside in white silence. Ethan stood at the window, mug in hand, staring at the trees bowed heavy with frost. He thought of the men he'd lost, Ben Carter, Tom Holloway, and the families he couldn't save. Then he thought of Daisy curled inside her borrowed pack. She was just a pup, yet in her stillness he saw the whole weight of waiting, the kind of loyalty that endures even when abandoned. He knew then, as sure as he once knew, the grip of a rifle, that he could not leave her. He turned back to the fire, to the pup in the backpack, and for the first time since leaving the service, something stirred in the hollow places inside him. Not joy, not yet, but the beginning of something that could grow. The storm broke by morning, leaving Anchorage wrapped in silence beneath thick white drifts. The streets muffled the trees bent under snow's weight. Ethan woke early, as he always had, body trained by years of rising before dawn. He brewed coffee in the dented kettle, its bitter smell filling the warm air. When he turned, Daisy was awake too, her head poking cautiously from the mouth of the backpack. Her amber eyes tracked his every move, ears twitching at the scrape of the chair and the clink of his cup. Ethan spoke little in those first days. In the cavalry, words had always been tools, orders, responses, short bursts in the field. Silence was the language he knew best. But now, as he spread out the Anchorage Daily News on the small kitchen table, he found himself reading aloud in a low, steady rhythm. The cadence filled the room with something other than the stove's hum, a rhythm that once soothed frightened men in foxholes, now wrapping around the cabin like a gentle shield. Daisy listened, or seemed to. She stayed curled in her pack, sometimes inching closer across the rug, ears flicking at every syllable, weighing the sound of his voice against the silence she had known too well. In those moments, Ethan McGraw wasn't truly alone. The cabin no longer felt like a hollow shell echoing with ghosts. He spoke to her not just headlines from the paper. He told Daisy about the desert sun that had scorched his skin, about skies so wide and empty that only wind and the crack of gunfire filled them. He told her about Tom Holloway, broad-shouldered and booming, who once carried a stray pup through an entire patrol just to see children's faces light up when they returned. Daisy tilted her head as he spoke, and though she couldn't grasp the words, Ethan imagined she understood the weight beneath them. Every afternoon, close to 3, Daisy would rise. She had learned the rhythm of the town, the faint rumble of buses pushing through snow and ice. Her paws clicked across the wood floor as she padded to the window, climbing onto the old bench Ethan once used for gear. From that perch, she fixed her gaze on the road curving down to the bus stop. Her body stiffened, ears pricked, eyes unblinking. She never barked, never whined, just waited as if each vehicle might return the figure she longed for. Ethan stood nearby, coffee cooling in his hand, and watched her. He recognized that posture. Soldiers on watch, relentless, loyal. It broke him and steadied him at once. He remembered the men left behind, the hours staring at empty roads, waiting as if endurance itself were the mission. Neighbors sometimes passed his lane, though few lingered in the cold. On the second afternoon, Hattie Boone trudged up the path. She was near 70, a retired nurse with a frame still upright, her cheeks ruddy from windburn. A thick parka wrapped her small body, and she carried a bag of supplies in one gloved hand. Hattie had spent her life mending others. Her words were blunt, but her heart was steady. She'd known Ethan since the day he bought the cabin, once dropping casseroles at his door, always asking too many questions. She suspected he lived with ghosts, but never pressed. That day she knocked and stepped inside without waiting the way old neighbors sometimes do. Her brows lifted at the sight of Daisy. "Well now, what have we here?" Her voice rasped from decades of late hospital shifts. Ethan offered little, only that he'd found the pup in the storm. Hattie crouched, joints creaking, her eyes sharp with a nurse's instinct. "Thin," she muttered, "but she'll be fine if you keep at her. GermanShepherd. Yes, loyal as they come. They'll stick with you to the end." She reached out, then stopped short, letting Daisy test the air. The pup held still cautious, then twitched her nose once. Hattie smiled, straightened, and pressed the bag into Ethan's hand. "Cans? Broth? For her and for you. Don't starve yourselves." Then she was gone. Boots crunching back down the snowy lane. Daisy returned to her vigil at the window, as if nothing had changed. Ethan stood by the stove, the folded note still in his pocket, and felt something unfamiliar, an edge of community, however faint. Hattie's presence reminded him he wasn't entirely cut off, though solitude was his choice. But Daisy wasn't tethered to the living neighbor she was tied to, absence, to the memory of small hands zipping her into that pack. As days blurred together, Ethan shifted his routine. He woke early, brewed coffee, read aloud in his low, steady voice. Daisy sniffed at the food he set out eating with more confidence each day, though always slowly, as though rationing against hunger. Afterward, she retreated into the backpack, clinging to its cramped walls, rather than the blanket Ethan laid by the fire. At 3, she climbed onto the bench to watch the road. Sometimes Ethan joined her silent, both of them waiting. No buses stopped. No children appeared. Still she kept watch. And at night, when the cabin settled into quiet and the wind pressed soft against the walls, Ethan sometimes found Daisy awake, eyes glinting in the dark. He whispered to her, then words he had never spoken to another soul, about the silence after a firefight, about carrying men to helicopters, about medals sealed in a box he never opened. She never flinched, never judged. Only blinked, slowly, tilting her head as if holding the space for him. And in that shared silence, Ethan understood something: Daisy was not afraid of quiet. She had been abandoned into it, but she had not broken. She had turned, waiting, into a kind of strength. Ethan envied her for that. He too had known the weight of waiting the letters that never came. The brothers who never returned the endless nights before dawn broke. Ethan McGraw had believed himself hardened by life, shaped and scarred, but in Daisy, he saw a reflection. Perhaps waiting wasn't weakness. Perhaps it was a form of loyalty, even its own kind of love. By the end of that week, when Ethan read aloud from the newspaper and Daisy shifted closer across the rug, resting just outside the backpack instead of inside, he realized the cabin had changed. It no longer echoed emptily. Something living steadfast had filled its silence. Yet at 3 each afternoon, Daisy still climbed to the window, and Ethan still stood beside her, both of them watching the road for someone who might never return. The days after Hattie Boone's visit settled into a rhythm coffee newspaper, Daisy's careful meals, and her vigilant watch at the window. Anchorage had sunk into midwinter hush, a silence broken only by the distant growl of plows along the main roads. Ethan carried the folded note from Daisy's backpack in his jacket pocket. Everywhere its words burned into his mind. Her name is Daisy. I'm sorry. I had to. Please be kind, she's good. That child's plea echoed in him. One sleepless night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the note unfolded before him. The stove had cooled to embers, the air chilled, and Daisy lay curled in her backpack beside the fire, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Ethan rubbed his face, gray-blue eyes, heavy, yet restless. He thought of the children he'd seen during deployments, children bearing more than any should, carrying fear in their eyes, yet managing a faint smile when offered a ration bar or a scrap of candy. He recalled his own childhood in a small Oregon rental house where shouting filled the walls more often than laughter, his father's temper flaring after too many bottles, his mother's silence like ice across the dinner table. He had escaped into the Marines at 18, carrying scars no uniform could hide. He looked at Daisy, her paw twitching in a dream, and whispered, "Who left you? And why here?" But she offered no answer, only the soft rhythm of sleep. The next morning, Ethan reached for the phone. He had avoided calls since retiring, keeping the line for emergencies only, but now it seemed the only thread to pull. He thought of someone who might know Sarah Whitlow, who had once lived down the road before moving closer into Anchorage. She had taught at the elementary school for nearly 20 years. Sarah was in her early 40s, though life had carved its own lines into her face. Tall and lean auburn hair always pulled into a practical knot. She carried a presence that calmed children and unsettled adults. Ethan remembered her steady green eyes flecked with hazel and the quiet authority in her voice. When she picked up, her tone was brisk. "Sarah Whitlow." "It's Ethan McGraw," he said, voice rough from lack of sleep. A pause, then her softening. "Ethan, haven't heard from you in a long time. You all right?" "I found a dog," he said simply. He explained the storm, the backpack, the note. Sarah didn't interrupt, only hummed faintly, absorbing every word. Finally, she asked, "GermanShepherd pup, you said yes. 5 or 6 months old, female named Daisy." Silence stretched over the line. Then Sarah exhaled sharply. "There's a boy, Caleb Dawson, 11. He went missing last week after leaving his uncle's place. People have been worried sick." Ethan's chest tightened. What about the Uncle Sarah's voice carried a bitter edge? Man had a reputation, hard drinker temper like a whip. There were reports of shouting bruises, but nothing stuck. The boy's mother wasn't around, so he ended up there, and now he's gone. Ethan looked at Daisy, who lifted her head from the backpack, watching him, as if she recognized the name had been spoken. "You think the boy left her at the bus stop?" he asked. "It fits," Sarah said quietly. He might have thought it safer for her, safer than where he was headed. Ethan closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter, chest heavy with memories of his own childhood. "He's just a kid," he murmured. 11 years old shouldn't mean running from home in a storm," Sarah replied. "He's resilient, quiet in class. Skinny, pale hair that never stayed combed, but eyes older than they should be. He never smiled much, until he got that dog. Then he'd light up show pictures, tell everyone she was his best friend." Ethan's gaze drifted to Daisy. She had stretched from the backpack, and now lay on the rug, lean but stronger than when he first carried her in. She met his eyes, unblinking, steady, as though hearing Sarah's words through the air. "I'll ask around, Sarah," Whitlow said. "But Ethan, if you really have his pup, you might be holding the key to finding him." After they hung up, Ethan McGraw stayed seated at the table, the phone heavy in his hand. Outside, snow drifted lazily, covering tracks before they could form. Daisy Rose padded to the window bench and climbed up, settling into her usual 3 o'clock watch, though no bus would stop today. Ethan followed, standing beside her hand, brushing lightly over her back. "You're waiting for him," he murmured. "And maybe I am too." That night, sleep avoided him. He lay on the couch near the fire, staring at the ceiling beams, memories unspooling like old film. He thought of his father, the bruises he had learned to hide, the nights he'd wished anyone would step in. He thought of the boy Sarah had described, and how easily the story could have been his own had the Marines not given him a way out. Daisy stirred on the rug, shifting in her dreams, and Ethan sat up, running a hand through his hair. He saw in Caleb Dawson a reflection of himself, of what might have been. Both had been lonely children. Both had found anchors in something loyal that could not speak, yet never betrayed. By dawn, Ethan had made his decision. He couldn't undo his own past, but he could try for the boy. He would follow the trail Sarah had opened, however faint. Daisy, he thought, wasn't just waiting for her lost companion, she was guiding him toward something he could not ignore. The morning after his sleepless night, Ethan McGraw made calls. He reached out to numbers Sarah Whitlow had provided contacts in the Anchorage Child Welfare Network, people she trusted from years of teaching children who sometimes slipped through the cracks. The process was slow. He told Daisy's story again and again, described the note in the backpack, and insisted the dog's presence might connect directly to the missing boy. Most on the other end were cautious, constrained by protocol, but one voice eventually broke through, a woman named Rosa Alvarez, a caseworker with Child Protective Services. Rosa was in her early 40s, Latina medium height, curly black hair streaked with silver, and kind, firm brown eyes that had seen too much sorrow, but never hardened against it. When Ethan met her outside the Anchorage Social Services building that afternoon, she wore a navy blouse under a thick charcoal coat and carried a worn leather satchel stuffed with files. Her manner was direct, but warm. "I heard from Sarah," she said, studying Daisy with quiet intensity. "This is the pup, isn't it?" Daisy pressed close to Ethan's leg, wary but curious. Rosa crouched slowly, her movements calm, extending a hand just enough for Daisy to sniff. "She's been waiting for him," Ethan said. "And I think he's been waiting too." Rosa nodded. "Caleb is safe now. We placed him with a temporary foster family 2 days after the storm. He's quiet, withdrawn." "The kind of silence that worries me," she added, looking at Ethan with soft eyes. "If you're right, if this is his dog, it could change everything." The drive to the foster home took nearly an hour. Snow still clung to the roadside, though plows had carved passable lanes. Ethan kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting briefly on Daisy's back, whenever she shifted on the seat beside him. Daisy sat upright, amber eyes fixed on the blur of trees and power lines, ears flicking at every passing sound. She seemed to know something awaited her, trembling with anticipation rather than fear. The foster home was a modest 2-story house on a quiet street in East Anchorage. The yard was small, but neat. A half-collapsed snowman leaning by the fence, a string of colored lights still hanging along the porch. Rosa led the way to the door, where a woman opened it before they could knock. She introduced herself as Nora Pike, late 30s, tall and slim, sandy blonde hair pulled back into a bun. Her eyes were kind but tired, the look of someone balancing work family and the fragile hearts of children carrying heavy histories. She ushered them inside with a warm, cautious smile. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and laundry detergent. On the couch sat a boy, knees drawn up, a faded hoodie draped over his thin frame. Caleb Dawson was smaller than Ethan had imagined, 11, but slight freckles scattered across pale skin, light brown hair falling into his eyes. His shoulders hunched, body coiled inward, bracing even in a safe place. He looked up as they entered, gray-green eyes widening. Daisy froze at the doorway. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Caleb whispered Daisy, and the pup bolted forward, the backpack, the waiting at the window, the cautious steps gone in an instant. She leapt onto the couch, pausing only to press her muzzle hard against the boy's chest. Ethan McGraw dropped to his knees on the rug, wrapping his thin arms around Daisy, and the sound that tore from his throat was half sob, half laugh. Tears streamed down his face as he buried it in her fur. "I'm sorry," he kept whispering, voice cracked and desperate. "I didn't want to. I had to. I'm sorry." Daisy trembled against him, her body vibrating with relief, letting out soft, sharp, but joyous whines. She licked his face, his hands any piece of him she could reach, pressing closer, as if trying to melt into him, to erase the distance that had separated them. Ethan stood by the doorway, throat tight. He had seen reunions before, men embracing family after tours, brothers finding each other after battles, but nothing like this. This was pure, wordless need, the healing of a wound that had festered too long. His vision blurred, and he pressed a hand against the frame to steady himself. Rosa Alvarez's eyes glistened too, though her voice remained steady. This is what we fight for," she whispered. Nora Pike stood with her hand over her mouth, tears slipping past her fingers. Ethan's mind was pulled backward, unbidden, to a desert airstrip years ago. He remembered stepping off a transport plane, the sun glaring hot, the shouts and cries of families rushing forward. A fellow Marine, battered but alive, had grabbed him in a crushing embrace, the kind that carried both grief and gratitude. Ethan had not cried then. He had been too numb, too armored. But now, watching Caleb Dawson and Daisy, his chest cracked open. The strength of one embrace could stitch pieces back together, if only for a moment. Minutes passed before Ethan finally pulled back, face streaked with tears, hands still tangled in Daisy's fur. She waited patiently. "I told her to wait," he whispered, looking up at Rosa, then at Ethan. "Know himself. I promised I'd come back." Rosa crouched beside him, steady eyes. "She never gave up on you, son. Not for a second." Ethan pressed his face back into Daisy's neck, letting the silence settle. Words were unnecessary now. Everything that mattered was in the trembling pup, the shaking boy, and the fragile, unbreakable bond between them. For a few brief days after the reunion, the world outside Ethan McGraw's cabin seemed softer, lighter, as though the snow itself reflected a gentler light. Daisy's energy shifted. She still curled in her old backpack at night, but now her body carried steadier rhythms. Her tail wagged faintly when she heard Ethan's voice. Ears pricked every time she recognized Caleb's name. Their visits weren't constant. Rules and schedules were dictated by Child Protective Services, but every weekend, Ethan drove Daisy back into the city to see Caleb. The visits became ritual. Caleb, thin and still, lighting up the moment Daisy leapt from Ethan's truck, would collapse into her in the snow, or on the rug inside boy and dog clinging, as though every heartbeat confirmed the other's survival. Ethan often stood apart, letting the moment belong to them, though each time his chest ached with something he couldn't name, a mixture of pride, longing, and the quiet ache of knowing the world could still be cruel, even when it returned what it had taken. But the foster placement was temporary. Rosa Alvarez explained it clearly one gray Tuesday afternoon as she sat with Ethan in a small CPS office. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, her pen clicking as she flipped through Caleb's file. Her face was tired, eyes ringed with shadows, but her voice carried steady compassion. "We found a family in Fairbanks willing to adopt Caleb permanently," she said, measured. "Stable 2 parents, professional backgrounds. They've gone through the training and are ready to take him in." Ethan leaned back, arms crossed. His gray-blue eyes narrowed, not in distrust of Rosa, but from the protective instinct that had long fused into his bones. And Daisy Rosa hesitated. "That's where it gets complicated. The family is hesitant. They worry a dog, especially one tied so closely to Caleb's trauma, might trigger memories, set back his adjustment. We've seen cases like that before." Silence settled heavy in the room. Daisy had been more than a companion. She had been Caleb's anchor, his promise in the storm. To strip her away now felt crueler than the hardships already endured. "He'll need her," Ethan said quietly. "He's stronger with her." "I know," Rosa admitted, voice softening. "But families make decisions based on what they think they can handle, and we can't force them to take Daisy." That night, Ethan drove back to his cabin. Daisy curled silently in the passenger seat. Snow drifted across the road, glittering under the headlights. The pup rested her chin on the edge of the seat, amber eyes reflecting the dashboard glow, as if sensing the weight pressing down on him. Back at the cabin, Ethan stoked the fire until the room glowed orange. Settling into the old armchair, newspaper untouched, Daisy climbed from her backpack onto the rug at his feet. Ethan watched the flames flicker. His hand drifted to stroke Daisy's head, feeling the softness of her ears, the steady thump of her tail. His voice was low, nearly swallowed by the crackle of wood. "If they won't take you, girl, then you'll stay with me. You'll never be left out in the cold again." Daisy lifted her head, meeting Ethan McGraw's gaze with eyes far too knowing for her young age. Slowly she pressed her muzzle into his palm, leaning against him with quiet certainty. Ethan's throat tightened. He had spoken words to her he once wished someone had said to him as a boy. "You'll never be abandoned." The weeks that followed blurred with limbo. Ethan continued his drives to Anchorage, letting Daisy and Caleb Dawson spend precious hours together under supervision. Caleb opened more with each visit, speaking in halting sentences about school, the foster home, even his uncle revealing the scars he carried, but also the strength within him. Daisy never left his side, head often resting on his knee, guarding every word. The new family from Fairbanks eventually arranged to meet Caleb. Their names were Samuel Reed and Lydia Reed. They drove 6 hours south through the snow to Anchorage, arriving in a clean white SUV dusted with frost. Samuel, in his early 40s, broad-shouldered with dark hair neatly trimmed, worked as an engineer. Maggie had explained he had the kind of steady patience that made children feel safe. Lydia, tall and lean, with warm brown eyes and a calm smile, was a nurse who had spent years in pediatric wards. Her auburn braid swung across one shoulder, movements carrying the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to comforting frightened children in sterile, overwhelming hospital rooms. They greeted Caleb with warmth, kneeling to his level, speaking softly, asking about his favorite books and foods. Caleb responded shyly, not coldly, his hand never leaving Daisy's collar. Lydia glanced at the pup, then at Rosa Alvarez, hesitation flickering in her eyes. "She's a beautiful dog," she said carefully, "but we're not sure. Caleb's been through so much already. We want to give him a stable start." Caleb's face tightened, grip on Daisy's fur firm. "She's mine," he whispered, voice raw. "She waited for me." Ethan stood a few feet away, fists clenched. He wanted to speak, to insist, but he bit down the words. This wasn't his fight. It was Caleb's truth, Daisy's loyalty. He watched Lydia's eyes soften as she looked between the boy and the dog, torn between caution and compassion. That evening after the meeting ended, Ethan returned to his cabin. Daisy followed to the fireside, pressing close, as though sensing his heavy thoughts. He knelt on the rug heat of the fire, warming his face, and whispered again, "If they say no, you'll stay with me. I'll never let you be left behind." Daisy rested her muzzle against his arm, trembling not with fear, but with the quiet bond of trust. The morning of the move dawned bright. Sunlight filtered through the frost-rimmed windows of Ethan McGraw's cabin, scattering across the wooden floor like shards of gold. He had been awake long before dawn, moving quietly as if on a mission. He packed Daisy's few belongings, the dented food bowl, the flannel blanket she trusted, and the old weather-stained backpack. That backpack, once a symbol of abandonment, had become the thread stitching their stories together. Daisy padded behind him, paws soft on the floor, body stronger now than the trembling pup Ethan had first lifted from the snow. At 6 months, her lean coat gleamed black and tan ears, alert eyes, carrying the wisdom of loss, but the spark of loyalty. She sniffed at the bag, then looked up at Ethan as if asking if it was truly time. Ethan knelt, scratching behind her ears. "One more ride, girl. Today we see if they'll keep you both together." The drive to Fairbanks was long roads bordered by endless forests and frozen rivers, the horizon a sweep of white broken only by scattered houses. Daisy curled in the passenger seat, occasionally lifting her head to watch the blur of trees, other times resting her muzzle on Ethan's arm. He drove steadily, thoughts heavy but not hopeless. He had promised her she'd never be abandoned again, and he intended to keep that promise whatever decision the Reeds made. By mid-afternoon, Ethan pulled into the quiet Fairbanks neighborhood. The Reeds' house stood modest but welcoming pale blue, with a wide porch wind chimes tinkling in the crisp air smoke curling from the chimney. A fenced backyard stretched behind, dotted with a half-buried wooden swing set. Samuel opened the door as they approached, wearing a thick wool sweater and jeans solid as the beams holding the house upright. Dark hair combed neatly, expression calm, but weighted with responsibility. Lydia appeared beside him, tall and graceful auburn braid over one shoulder. She wore a simple gray cardigan, warm brown eyes focused first on Caleb, who stood just inside clutching his backpack strap, then on Daisy tail, thumping cautiously. Caleb Dawson's face lit up the instant Daisy leapt from Ethan McGraw's truck. He dropped his bag and ran across the snow, his thin frame bursting with energy. Daisy bounded toward him, ears flying back, body quivering with joy. They collided near the porch boy and dog, tumbling into the snow. Caleb wrapped his arms tightly around her neck, and Daisy pressed against him, letting out sharp, joyous whines, her whole body vibrating with relief. Sarah Whitlow and Samuel Reed exchanged a glance. Ethan saw hesitation in their eyes, the echo of doubts Rosa Alvarez had mentioned. But he also saw something else stirring recognition. No lecture, no file, no careful explanation could match the undeniable truth of the reunion before them. "Look at them," Ethan said quietly, voice low but firm. "She's not just his dog. She's his anchor." Sarah's eyes softened. She stepped forward, crouching near Caleb, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Caleb," she said, tone calm and careful, the way only a nurse who had comforted countless frightened children could speak. "Do you feel better when she's with you?" Caleb nodded fiercely, tears spilling down his cheeks. "She waited for me," he whispered. "She always waited." Samuel exhaled, broad shoulders sinking. "Then maybe we were wrong to hesitate," he admitted. He looked at Sarah, who nodded slowly. Together they rose their decision, wordless but clear. Inside the house, warmth enveloped them. The smell of bread, baking the quiet hum of a home, filled with steady routines. Rosa Alvarez was already there, sitting at the dining table with a stack of papers. Her brown eyes lit when she saw Daisy pressed against Caleb's leg, as though she too knew this was the moment that mattered. "Looks like we have our answer," Rosa said softly. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out the old backpack. He held it for a moment, fabric-frayed straps worn from snow and time. Then he crouched before Caleb, offering it to him. "This was hers when I found her," Ethan said. "She waited inside it for you," he continued. "But it doesn't have to be a sad thing anymore. It's yours now, not as a memory of being left, but proof that love never walked away." Caleb's hands trembled as he took it. He pressed his face into Daisy's fur, then looked up at Ethan, eyes wide and tear-bright. "Thank you," he whispered. Ethan only nodded, throat too tight for words. Later, after the paperwork was signed and goodbyes exchanged, Ethan stepped back onto the porch. The air was crisp, the late sun sinking low, painting the snow in hues of rose and gold. Inside, Caleb sat on the rug with Daisy curled at his side, head on his knee, eyes half closed in contentment. For the first time, Ethan saw no fear in the boy's posture, only peace. The drive back to Anchorage was quiet. The passenger seat, once occupied by Daisy, felt strange without her warmth. Yet Ethan did not feel hollow. Instead, there was calm, a sense that something unfinished within him had been completed. When he returned to his cabin, the fire had gone cold. He lit it again, sparks catching quickly, and settled into his chair. The house still bore its silence, but it no longer pressed so heavily. For the first time in years, Ethan did not feel alone. Daisy and Caleb had found each other again, and he had played a part in weaving that thread back together. Leaning back, eyes half closed, the crackle of fire filling the space, Ethan murmured, "Family." In that moment he knew that in helping the boy and the pup he had found a piece of it for himself. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't thunder or fire from the heavens, but the quiet faithfulness of a dog who waits, and the strength of a child who still believes someone will come back. In Daisy's waiting, and Caleb's hope, we see a reflection of love, constant, patient, unyielding. It's a reminder that even when we feel abandoned or forgotten, the world can still weave threads of reunion and healing in ways we cannot yet see. As you go about your days, remember this story as proof that love never truly leaves us. Even in silence, even in storms, care and faith endure. If this story touched your heart, share it with others. Leave a comment and subscribe to our channel to continue walking with us on journeys of hope and healing. Write Amen in the comments if you believe love, loyalty, and second chances still work miracles.